28th of June 1914, the crude assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire by a romantic young Bosnian nationalist unleashed forces which would plunge the world into an inconceivable man-made Holocaust. World War I, the Great War. Within weeks, the forces of the great European imperial powers would be mobilized, heading on a collision course, sucking the whole world into a deadly vortex. A pitiless conflict which would, in only 4 years, leave 9 million dead on the battlefields, cause untold human suffering and grief, and utterly transform the face of the world and warfare. But the squalid murder of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife at Sarajevo had merely fired the tinder of suspicion, conflict, and imperial rivalry which had been smoldering in Europe for decades. At the center of this fomentation was German ambition. Under the wily master diplomat Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, 35 disparate German states had been fused into one, and success in arms in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had given the young Germany a firm footing as a European military force. The next 3 decades saw mammoth strides in industrialization, technology, education, and overseas trade. Her population swelled by 20 million, while that of France, the old enemy, declined. By 1900, a strong, confident Germany felt ready to join the imperial club, to enter the world stage, a stage other powers may have considered already full. The other powers had cause for concern when Bismarck, whose diplomacy had been aimed solely at the defense and security of the infant Reich, was forced to resign by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Industrious and intelligent, but also vain, ambitious and impulsive, the new Kaiser assumed the mantle of warlord, totally identified with the far from diplomatic Prussian military caste, imbued with dreams of Germanic might. Yet there were more similarities than not among the imperial powers and their ruling classes, which should have been a strong bulwark to any thoughts of conflict. A cousinship of emperors was backed by an exclusive political and military elite, all equally at home in the sumptuous palaces, clubs and salons of Berlin, Vienna, Petrograd, London or Paris. In bitter contrast to the glittering gay lives of this ruling minority and their rich, privileged and dilettante entourage were the lackluster or impoverished lives of the majority, the mass of the populace. From the peasantry of the vast rural tracts of the Romanov Empire, whose state had changed little for centuries, to the city laboring classes living a squalid slum existence spawned by the Industrial Revolution. But the masses were no longer the products of some rigid feudalism. 19th century industrialization and education and the various sops to democracy had created an articulate but disgruntled industrial proletariat, eager to redress the injustices of the status quo. The spectre of socialism stalked the salons of the rich. There were also deep national divides to haunt the controllers of empire. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria ruled delicately over a 1,000-year empire of 17 disparate nationalities. Teutons, Slavs, Croats, Serbs, Poles, Czechs, Magyars. Even Britain was facing insurrection in the form of the Campaign for Home Rule in Ireland. The ruling dynasties of Europe, with their own deep internal political and social troubles, seem hardly likely to wage war against their own. Yet the arms race escalated and the drift to war went on. No one seemed to want war in 1914. Russia was still recovering from the fiasco of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. France was rearming, but had just returned a pacifist government and seemed on better terms with Germany. Austro-Hungary had its own critical problems with warring nationals in the Balkans. Britain was complacently content to police her empire. Even German industrialists were convinced that Germany would become the leading power in Europe from sheer economic strength. All the powers had strong armies or navies as deterrents. All the powers had alliances to check each other's aggression. All the powers had acute domestic problems. Who could possibly gain from a major conflict? Yet, in August 1914, the giant diplomatic chess game went terribly wrong. All the checks and balances preserving peace in Europe fell apart, and the alliances of the subtle old diplomacy were invoked. Germany with Austro-Hungary, and the Entente cordiale between Russia, France and Britain. There is little doubt that the Kaiser was the warmonger of the peace. In December 1912, he'd called a war council of Germany's military elite, snubbing the diplomats. German nation became identified with German military and imperial power. In 1900, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz had laid a 15-year plan for a vast shipbuilding program. Its blatant aim: to provide the German Empire with a weapon to wrest its fair share of colonial power from the British. By 1914, the Kiel Canal had been widened to allow the great new dreadnoughts through from the Baltic to the North Sea. By 1914, Germany had a superbly trained land army under an officer corps trained in the matchless Prussian tradition. Finally, Count Alfred von Schlieffen had given the Reich a superlative war plan should war break out. Germany at last was ready, if not eager, for war. In essence, the Schlieffen plan was simple. While 4 German armies performed a defensive role along their own frontier, the other 3 large armies would smash through Belgium in a giant arc, outflanking the French. Speed and surprise would sweep the French from the board. The German armies could then turn and reinforce the holding action against the slowly mobilizing Russians in the east. This would be a solution to the great fear: a war on 2 fronts. The Schlieffen plan was literally based on German rail running to time. The 9:45 Berlin to Brussels was still the Berlin-Brussels. Only the cargo had ominously changed. At Sarajevo, the perpetual waiting ended, and the ball of European war began to roll from the Balkan storm center ever outwards. Ultimatums, threats and counter-threats flew across Europe. But the die was cast as vain ambition, obligation, naive public pressure, or just plain fear drove the powers into combat one by one. Millions of troops were drawn by train to the battle zones with exuberant cries of "To Berlin" or "To Paris." But reaching the railhead was one thing, bringing the huge armies to the front quite another. A soldier on foot was no faster in 1914 than a century before, when the same forces had clashed at Waterloo. The logistics of handling and supplying these great land armies with their heavy artillery and weaponry were awesome. To move one division of 12,000 men with their horses, stores and equipment took 1,000 rail cars. From the railhead followed a slog to the front, through the churned mud. Fully disgorged from a train, a division took up 15 miles of road and took 5 hours to pass one point. The German First Army alone numbered 320,000 men. If Germany had provided the mainspring of action, it was the system of alliances that ensured the scale of the war. The great armies, genuinely raised to provide security and preserve peace, once committed, took on an unstoppable momentum of their own. As if drawn like a magnet to the cherished Alsace-Lorraine, the French war plan sent them north towards the Rhine, playing right into the hands of the Germans. On the 4th of August 1914, contemptuous of Belgian neutrality, the awesome German armies swept across their frontiers. The nightmare of World War I had begun. The first illusion that the war would be a war of movement was quickly dispelled as the fast-moving German army's momentum petered out at the Marne. Some units of von Kluck's depleted and exhausted First Army on the outside of the Arc had marched an average of 25 miles a day. Even if the Germans had won the Battle of the Marne, they could get no further. Their lines of communication to the High Command outpaced, their supply lines stretched to the limit. These modern armies could not live off the land. The German spring ran out of coil. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The courageous stand of brave little Belgium at the fortresses of Liège had held up the German thrust for a vital 11 days, allowing the Allied forces time to organize and resist. In the east, the early stages of the war went badly for the Central Powers, repulsed with contemptuous ease from Serbia by some of the best natural fighters in the world. Defeated by the ragged but overwhelming Russian hordes at Gumbinnen and forced to evacuate Galicia. But all this was reversed in the tactically brilliant Battle of Tannenberg, where the Germans defeated a Russian force twice their size, taking 100,000 prisoners. 2 men emerged from this, the greatest German victory of the war, who would later run the entire German war effort. Paul von Hindenburg, a 66-year-old career soldier called from retirement, and as counterpart, the brilliant strategist Erich Ludendorff. As the various outflanking moves in the early months on the Western Front and checked, ending in the inconclusive race to the sea, the offensive petered out, the war of movement stalled, and both sides dug in from Switzerland to the sea. In the east, a looser front line was drawn as bewildered armies gave in the search for each other in the great empty land far from the railheads. On no man's land between the lines, incurious peasants still tilled the soil. Deadlock and winter set in on both fronts. The war would not be over by Christmas. The costs of 1914's military operations were staggering. The casualty lists already stretched into millions, and all the armies could show for the carnage was stalemate, a deadly stalemate that would last for years. Expectation came face to face with brutal reality as 1 million refugees with their pathetic bundles fled from occupied Belgium, and comic opera cavalry officers with their plumes and pennants and outmoded swords, lances and ideas viewed the fields of battle with utter bewilderment. This was not the swift, glorious war they had come for. On the home fronts, each of the warring nations had been gripped by an August madness in 1914, as men everywhere responded to the call to arms in a ferment of patriotic fervor. In Britain, recruits of all ages flocked to enlist. This was not a peasants' war, nor a war of professional soldiers. Whole university classes, whole workplaces, whole towns and villages went to war in the PALS battalions. The people they had lived and worked with became the people they died with. The men of whole townships could be virtually wiped out in a major battle. This was not to be the brief, glorious interlude in their lives, where the call to duty also held the promise of high adventure, the glamour of uniform, a break from monotony, and for some, the first-time prospect of steady pay. In the countries where conscription was the rule, the ardor to join the fight was no less strong. Europe was gripped by war hysteria. God, it seemed, was on everyone's side, even the Kaisers. God heard the embattled nations sing and shout, "God strafe England," and "God save the King," "God this," and "God that," and "God the other thing." "Good God," said God, "I've got my work cut out." In Britain, the streets, music halls and even pulpits responded to the infectious welling of nationalist passion and sentiment. The royal family even changed their Germanic names. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha became Windsor. Battenberg became Mountbatten. But there was an ugly side to the popular zeal, a cruel xenophobia. Hatred for Kaiser Bill the Bully was translated into outrage, as anyone with a foreign-sounding name ran the gauntlet of looting mobs. The foreigner was the enemy. The role of propaganda as a weapon took on a focus and importance as never before. The development of the mass daily newspaper gave the propagandists a perfect vehicle to peddle their simplified, sensationalized, jingoistic, and rarely truthful message. The image of the enemy as a monster was readily absorbed by a war-thirsty public, while the idea of war as heroic and glorious was nurtured by economic use of the truth when it came to the harsh realities. On the government level, there were massive internments of so-called aliens. But Britain was not alone in its reaction, with foreign nationals trapped in Germany and Austria. But support for the war was not universal. In the cities, the departure points for troops and the locus for recruitment, the mood was catching. But in the vast rural tracts of Europe, the war was treated with resignation or apathy. Britain, safe from invasion, could talk glibly about a just war as she responded to the fate of little Belgium. But mainland Europe had seen it all before. No men to harvest the land, homes destroyed, the wretched refugee trail. The prolonged war caused colossal problems for the politicians. In Britain especially, the economy had to be put on a military footing to feed the voracious fronts. Continuing recruitment left serious gaps in industrial manpower. Too late, the government realized it had lost valuable miners and steel workers to the front in the initial surge of enthusiasm, and tried vainly to get them back before the front claimed them terminally. But most breaches in industry began to fill with women, and eventually with children, cynically legalizing a practice that had long been standard in families on the breadline. While middle-class suffragettes hailed the increase in the female workforce as a blow struck for emancipation, the truth among the working class was that this was merely a shift in labor. More money could be earned in the munitions factories than in domestic service or the textile mills. But the propagandists made capital of this new female home army, despite the protests and resentment in traditional male workplaces and claims of moral danger and child neglect. Any glamour soon wore off as women found themselves doing 2 jobs and working incredible hours. Most families had lost at least one breadwinner to the army, and with inflation soaring and without compensation, any increase in wages was soon wiped out. Only the profiteers made money from the war. Happily for the politicians, especially in Germany, the class truce held firm, and the Kaiser could gratefully utter in the socialist-dominated Reichstag, "I see no parties here, only Germans." In this initial spirit of cooperation and unity, the war machines were fed, and the war went on. The entry of Britain and her navy to the war ensured that a European war became a world war, as the war was carried to wherever Germany or her allies had influence. The British Navy carried troops where and when she pleased, and the German Grand Fleet could do little to interfere. Britannia ruled the waves. The entry of Japan to the war on the 23rd of August 1914 ensured this overwhelming supremacy, which the German fleet commanders reacted to with chronic over-caution. The high seas saw little in the way of conflict, as the great dreadnoughts plied to and fro in blockade and counter-blockade. Their commanders reluctant to risk their precious charges, though in truth these great ships were the white elephants of the arms race, an outmoded, extravagant waste of technology and materials in the face of the silent menace, the submarine, which would emerge as Germany's only hope of breaking the crippling Allied blockade. One lone submarine act had a profound political effect on the war. On the 17th of May 1915, the German submarine U-20 torpedoed the Cunard liner Lusitania on the final stretch of her passage from New York to Liverpool. 1,198 men, women and children of the 2,000 passengers, including Americans, perished. As their bodies drifted onto the beaches of Kinsale, there was public outcry, especially from neutral America. It was later disclosed that the liner had indeed been carrying war materials, but the damage was done. The most powerful neutral nation, the United States, was inexorably drawn towards the Allied cause. The sinking of the Lusitania was not the only reminder of the ugly and deadly nature of modern warfare, and the submarine not the only weapon in the 20th century armory to dispel the last vestiges of romance from the contemplation of war. The impasse on the Western Front in 1915 was far from bloodless. Through winter, spring and autumn, fighting was continuous from end to end. Murderous, costly, futile, as both sides launched ill-coordinated offensives at the other's lines. Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, Artois, Champagne, Aubers Ridge, Ypres, Festubert. The mortars, howitzers and heavy artillery carved the unmistakable landscape that has remained the surreal image of the Great War. A blighted, muddy, bloody wasteland, strewn with the mutilated dead of conflict. Every soldier knew only his own war. The common soldier's bizarre world was a pinprick on the monumental stage of battle, in which he underwent the whole gamut of emotions, from rigid fear to abject boredom. Along his few hundred yards of front, he lived with his new family, his own squad or platoon, the only thing which made any sense in this nightmare world of rat-infested, lice-ridden mire and the all-pervading stench of cordite and decay. Contrary to persistent myth, only a quarter of the time was spent in the front-line trenches, but that time was a lifetime beggaring description. For the rest, should he survive, life had a predictable monotony, leavened only by a fatalistic, mildly insolent humor and the tight bonds of comradeship. But the humor was gathering a bitter tinge. Good morning, the General said, when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and we're cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack, as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack. But he did for them both, with his plan of attack. The generals were just as bewildered and trapped by the awesome leviathan that had been unleashed, as they tried helplessly to wield mammoth forces from map rooms far from the front, shouting contradictory orders down the field telephones through a muddled chain of command. Communications were abysmal, a hodgepodge of runners, carrier pigeons and flares, with most telephone lines cut by barrages. Once committed to an offensive, the generals had little, if any, control of events. Battles became confused happenings in the fog of war. Yet the phenomena of national solidarity amidst unconscionable bloodletting and hardship held firm with only minor flickers of discontent. Public opinion, whipped up by the press and sensationalist propaganda, extended the status of demigod to the military leaders. Hindenburg, Kitchener, and Joffre personified the will to victory for their countries. Every loyal citizen was expected to have unquestioning faith in these great warriors, who, in truth, were out of their depth as they scrabbled for the elusive victory that would end the nightmare. As the first fragile biplanes appeared above the smoke of battle, a new dimension was added to the war, an embryo which would lead in only 30 years to the horrors of Hiroshima, war from the air. But air power was in its infancy, the plane merely a tool for reconnaissance, primitive ground strafing and minor disruption to enemy troop movement and supply lines. The romanticized dogfights of the Knights of the Air with the forces of the legendary Red Baron von Richthofen were more of a spectacle for the tired press infantry below than an influence on the course of the war. Even the giant Zeppelins, more of a threat to their crews than their target, were viewed as an extravaganza by a gawping public. The plane was still the babe of war. While the seesawing on the Eastern Front continued through 1915, the entry of the Italians on the Allied side in May opened up a whole new front in the Tyrol and a new form of warfare, based on the maxim, who holds the heights holds the valleys. The supposed back door into Germany through Austria was virtually locked by nature. The Alpine War in Italy repeated the campaign in France, only under worse conditions. A series of barren attacks which achieved nothing. Italy, with plenty of men but little equipment and few heavy guns, became a pricey commodity for the Allied war effort. In September 1915, Foxy Ferdinand of Bulgaria, Serbia's neighbor, secretly allied with Germany. And in October, the British and French landed in Salonika in neutral Greece. in an act as unscrupulous as Germany's invasion of Belgium. This abortive gesture to aid Serbia would eventually tie up 600,000 troops in what German observers sardonically referred to as the greatest Allied internment camp of the war. Turkey was also proving a drain on Allied resources, sucking in more and more Empire troops into the campaigns in Mesopotamia and the Dardanelles. What began as a simple operation to safeguard oil installations in the Persian Gulf ended in the British humiliation in the Siege of Kut, where the starving remnants of the British force under the over-ambitious Townsend finally surrendered in April 1916 to the callous hands of the Turks. The emaciated Indian troops had starved rather than eat horse meat. Turkey, though a secondary enemy, was proving a tough opponent. At Gallipoli, the totally ill-equipped combined British, Anzac and French forces met fierce resistance from the Turks and could only manage to secure a tenuous foothold on the peninsula at Cape Helles and Anzac Cove before the campaign settled into the all-too-familiar trench stalemate, made unbearable by the extreme heat, disease and critical shortages of supplies. Vaunted British sea power was sadly lacking as another impasse in the war was reached. As 1916 opened, the last troops were evacuated from Gallipoli in a brilliant tactical withdrawal, ending the Dardanelles tragedy. A terrible, if magnificent, blunder. With decisive action, Turkey could have been forced out of the war. The trade route to Russia cleared, and even a new front opened against Germany. But the straits to the Black Sea remained tightly shut, and Russia cut off from her Western allies. The survivors of Gallipoli left 200,000 dead comrades behind, as many victims of disease as action. The architect of the fiasco, Winston Churchill, would not recover his reputation for the duration of the war. But the great slaughter was still to come. The war deepened, invading every facet of economic, political and social life. The war was becoming dangerous for the ruling elite, whose mismanagement and weakness was glaring. Now they could not afford to lose. The war was pursued with an even greater ferocity, as the front called for more and more men and shells and weapons to break the bloody deadlock. The stakes were high. The dead could not be seen to have died in vain. From this resolute drive on the Western Front came 3 battles which would become the symbol of World War I, of the dreadful slaughter, of the operations that went nowhere. The names: Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele. The ease with which the Germans had switched armies from front to front, from one flashpoint to another, through their superb strategic rail network, determined the frustrated Allies on an all-out assault in 1916. Concentric, military, naval and economic pressure to crush the Central Powers once and for all. The linchpin of the strategy was to be a massive attack where the Allied lines met at the Somme. But Germany had her own ideas. An assault on a target, a symbol to the French which they would be compelled to defend to the last. The fortresses of Verdun. At 7 in the morning of the 21st of February 1916, the Germans began the Great Battle with the most devastating bombardment ever seen in warfare. Yet, 10 months later, Verdun still held. French tenacity and the sacred way, the vital artery along which 3,000 lorries a day fed the beleaguered army, had kept Verdun alive, but at a terrible price. The great cauldron of destruction had claimed 700,000 French and German lives, and all for a few useless fortresses. The crass idiocy continued. With Verdun, the Somme had lost all strategic value as a battleground. Yet, with classic obstinacy, the British determined to go ahead against an enemy well prepared with a system of 40-foot deep dugouts, secure from the heaviest bombardment. It was inconceivable that this line could be forced. Yet, on the 1st of July, after 8 days of fruitless barrage, the British Fourth Army went over the top in perfect order. Wave after wave of infantry left their trenches on the hot July morning, only to be bogged down with their heavy packs in the tangled wire, craters and potholes of the bombardment. The Germans had ample time to emerge unscathed from their dugouts and commence an obscenely easy slaughter. With the last staccato stutter of machine gun fire, the guns fell silent over the Somme. By late afternoon, the British had suffered 60,000 casualties, a third of them dead, in the worst day of carnage of any army in the war and the bloodiest day in the history of British arms. It was 3 days before all the wounded could be brought in their agony from the killing field. Yet for a further 6 months, the bloodbath continued, with almost criminal disregard on the part of the generals who refused to back down from their boasts or deviate from their rigid plan. This was warfare by the book, an attempt to control the uncertainties and confusions of war by simply ignoring them. By the 13th of November, stubborn vanity on both sides had counted for over 1 million dead and wounded. The bloodied, hapless warriors of the Somme were to witness 2 events which were a symbol that war had changed forever. On the 14th of July, in a sudden early morning attack on the German front, 5 miles of the lines were overrun. Then came the great set piece of which every British general dreamt. The infantry saw a sight unique on the Western Front. 3 divisions of cavalry riding for the gap, bugles blowing, pennants flying, lances glittering. The glorious vision crumbled as the machine guns opened fire. Two months later, the first few British tanks rolled over the barbed wire. Idealism perished on the Somme. The enthusiastic volunteers were no longer enthusiastic. They had lost faith in their cause, in their leaders, and in everything except loyalty to their comrades. The civilian populations felt the war drawing ever nearer. The casualty lists were not of remote heroes, but of their own friends and relatives. Inflation set in. Food prices, with markets ungoverned, soared. Bread queues and soup kitchens abounded. The black market flourished. Germany, hit by a ruinous harvest and beginning to feel the bite of blockade, starved. But despite the hardships which encroached on the lives of larger and larger sections of the populace, in Britain, the rich could still afford to play. Perhaps a wing of a house had to close to conserve fuel, or a few domestic servants were shed to the munition factories. But there was always Ascot and the Derby, even if the gaiety of Paris was denied them. Still faced with glaring inequality, in every country cracks began to appear in the shaky social truce, which in 1914 had merely papered over the fissures of enmity between the power elite and the clarion voices of social reform. There were still only sporadic signs: bread riots, strikes against conscription, a growing lobby of conscientious objectors. But the growl of discontent grew louder. Nationalist unrest fed this fire. Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the abortive Easter rising of Irish separatists, Czech desertions from the polyglot Austro-Hungarian armies, already weak from the Russian Brusilov summer offensive of 1916. The offensive had far-reaching political consequences. The armies of the Habsburgs lost their fighting spirit. Unity, loyalty and cohesion vanished. But the loss of 1 million Russians in this last great Russian operation of the war ensured the downfall of the Romanovs, clearing the way for the revolutions of 1917 as the Russian soldiers voted with their feet and walked away from the war. In November 1916, the tragic old emperor Franz Joseph of Austria died, signaling the end of an epoch as his life's work crumbled. The empire he had fought and schemed for, torn asunder by war and insurrection. With him, the old Europe passed away forever. Total war, war which encroached on the lives of every citizen, had ensured this. The hollow promises of 1914 were by now a mockery, as the butcher's bill, in terms of wasted life, hunger, hardship, sacrifice and grief, was counted. Nationalist fervor, fired by deceitful propaganda, soured and turned to the disillusionment, despair and bitterness, written on the silent, drawn faces of those returning from the fronts. They ask me where I've been, and what I've done and seen. But what can I reply? Who knows it wasn't I, but someone just like me, who went across the sea, and with my head and hands, killed men in foreign lands. Though I must bear the blame, because he bore my name. But there was to be no peace or compromise as conscription filled the gaps left by the dead. And the warring nations tightened their belts and filled their armories for yet another year of war. A war of even more satanic devices to maim and kill, inspired by man's new technology. The submarine, the tank, and the most obscene and feared of all, gas. In contrast to Europe, America, who had remained virtuously aloof from the war, was experiencing the biggest boom year in her history. Growing rich, supplying Allied needs, while President Woodrow Wilson played the peacemaker. On the 18th of December 1916, Wilson invited the belligerent nations to state their peace terms. But he was too late. The leaders, Lloyd George in Britain, Neville for France, and the powerful Ludendorff were set against compromise. The Allies were determined to woo the US into the war. It would take only one last appeal to American idealism to bring her vast resources in on the Allied side. The Yanks would soon be coming, and the war would go on. As the troops crouched in misery in the trenches all along the Western Front, on this, their third bleak midwinter, they must have reflected ruefully on the empty promise of 1914, when they had been told they would be home by Christmas. But they had not been told which one.